Of all the deadly sins that damn the human soul, sloth might be the most misunderstood. We picture it as simple laziness, a man drowsing on his couch while life passes him by. But the demon who presides over this sin understood something far more sinister. Sloth is not mere idleness. It is the slow erosion of the will, the quiet surrender to apathy, the abandonment of purpose disguised as rest. And the prince who corrupts humanity through this particular vice wears two faces that seem to contradict each other entirely. His name is Belphegor, and he is a demon of profound contradictions. On one hand, he tempts mortals with ingenious inventions, whispering promises of effortless wealth through brilliant discoveries. On the other, he embodies complete spiritual and physical lethargy, the abandonment of all effort, all striving, all divine purpose. How can a single entity represent both innovation and stagnation? The answer lies in understanding what sloth truly means in Christian theology and in tracing the bizarre journey of this demon from ancient mountaintop to medieval grimoire to Renaissance satire. Belphegor's story begins not in hell's smoking chambers, but on a wind-swept peak in ancient Moab, where a god of opening and gap once demanded worship through acts that would horrify the faithful. It continues through centuries of theological evolution, emerging in the classification systems of witch-hunting bishops and the satirical pen of Niccolo Machiavelli himself. This is the tale of how a Moabite deity became Christian demonology's most paradoxical prince, and why understanding him reveals something essential about the nature of temptation itself. To understand Belphegor, we must travel back over 3 millennia to the plains of Moab, to a place called Shittim, where the Israelites camped on their journey to the Promised Land. The story recorded in Numbers chapter 25 describes one of the most shameful episodes in Israel's wilderness wandering, and it begins with a seduction orchestrated by an unlikely architect of doom. The Moabite king Balak had hired the prophet Balaam to curse the advancing Israelites, fearing their military might. When Balaam found himself unable to curse a people blessed by God, he devised a different strategy entirely. Rather than invoking divine wrath from above, he would corrupt Israel from within. The plan was simple and devastatingly effective. Send Moabite women to seduce the Israelite men, and through sexual intimacy, draw them into idolatrous worship. The biblical text is remarkably direct about what happened. The men of Israel began to indulge in sexual immorality with the women of Moab, who invited them to the sacrifices of their gods. The people ate the sacrificial meals and bowed down before these deities. Specifically, Israel joined themselves to Baal-Peor, and the anger of the Lord burned against them. Baal-Peor translates roughly to Lord of Pure, or Lord of the Opening. Peor was the name of the mountain where this deity was worshipped, but the word itself means gap, or opening, and scholars have long debated whether this has sexual or scatological connotations. The worship practices associated with Baal-Peor were closely tied to fertility rites that involved both sexual acts and what later rabbinic sources would describe with revulsion. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. God commanded Moses to execute the leaders who had participated in this idolatry. A plague broke out among the people. Then, in a moment of stunning arrogance, an Israelite man named Zimri brought a Midianite woman named Cosbi directly into the camp. flaunting his relationship before Moses and the entire weeping congregation. Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron the high priest, grabbed a spear and followed them into the tent where they had gone. With a single thrust, he killed them both in the act, and the plague stopped. But by then, 24,000 Israelites had already died. This incident at Peor became one of the most frequently referenced catastrophes in Hebrew scripture. Deuteronomy, Psalms, and the prophet Hosea all invoke it as a warning against the seductive power of idolatry. The psalmist writes that they joined themselves to Baal-Peor and ate sacrifices offered to the dead. Hosea laments that when the people came to Baal-Peor, they consecrated themselves to that shameful idol and became as vile as the thing they loved. The worship of Baal-Peor was considered particularly degrading because it combined sexual licentiousness with cultic practices that violated every standard of ritual purity. Some ancient sources suggest the god was worshipped in the form of a phallus, fitting the fertility cult pattern common throughout the ancient Near East. But more disturbing are the rabbinical accounts from the Babylonian Talmud that claim worshippers honored Baal-Peor by exposing themselves and defecating before the idol, offering excrement as a sacrifice. Whether this practice was historical or a later rabbinic invention designed to emphasize the deity's degradation is debated. But the association stuck. Baal-Peor became synonymous with the most shameful, debased form of idolatry imaginable, worship that reduced the divine to the scatological, that celebrated base bodily functions over spiritual transcendence. For over 1,000 years, Baal-Peor remained simply a cautionary tale in Jewish tradition, a reminder of what happens when God's people abandon their covenant for foreign gods and foreign pleasures. But as Christianity developed its complex demonology during the medieval and the early modern periods, theologians began to reimagine the old pagan deities not as false gods, but as actual demons who had deceived ancient peoples. Baal-Peor would be reborn as Belphegor, and his association with both sexuality and degradation would evolve into something stranger still. The process by which ancient deities became Christian demons was gradual and reflected centuries of theological development. Early Christians viewed pagan gods as either powerless idols or demonic entities masquerading as divine beings to lead humanity astray. By the medieval period, elaborate systems had emerged to classify these demons, assign them hierarchies, and understand their particular methods of temptation. Belfagor appears in Kabbalistic writings as the disputer, a demon who sows discord and argument among people. More significantly, these Jewish mystical texts identified him as the enemy of Tiferet, the sixth sephira on the Kabbalistic tree of life, which represents beauty, harmony, and balanced compassion. This opposition is philosophically intriguing. Why would a demon of sloth and degradation be specifically opposed to beauty? The answer lies in understanding beauty not merely as aesthetic pleasure, but as divine harmony. Tiferet balances mercy and severity, combining seeming opposites into graceful unity. Belphegor, as the disputer, disrupts this harmony. He creates discord where there should be peace, introduces ugliness where there could be beauty, and perhaps most tellingly, he disputes beauty's very existence. If beauty lies in the eye of the beholder, if there are no objective standards, then nothing is truly beautiful, and everything is permitted. the decay into relativism, into the belief that nothing matters enough to strive for it, is itself a form of sloth. This medieval understanding portrayed Belphegor as fundamentally opposed to the creative and unifying aspects of divine presence in the world, where beauty inspires effort, dedication, and the perfection of craft. Belphegor whispers that it is all meaningless, that the pursuit itself is foolish. Why struggle to create beauty when nothing endures? Why labor over art, philosophy, or righteousness when entropy will erase it all? The demon's method was subtle corruption through intellectual poison. He would not appear in fire and brimstone, demanding worship. Instead, he planted seeds of doubt, encouraged cynicism, suggested that wisdom lay in avoiding effort rather than embracing purpose. This made him particularly dangerous to monastics and theologians, whose entire lives were dedicated to spiritual labor. The monk battling acedia, the spiritual sloth that made prayer seem pointless and service burdensome, was wrestling with Belphegor's influence. But Belphegor's associations would crystallize most definitively in the late 16th century, when a German bishop and notorious witch hunter systematized the demonic hierarchy in a way that would echo through popular culture for centuries to come. Peter Binsfeld was born around 1540 in the village of Binsfeld in Germany's Eifel region. A farmer's son who showed exceptional intellectual gifts, he was sent to Rome for theological education and returned to become a prominent figure in the Counter-Reformation's battles against Protestantism. But Binsfeld's legacy would be secured not through theological disputation, but through his role in one of the most brutal witch trials in European history. Between 1587 and 1594, the region around Trier, where Binsfeld served as auxiliary bishop, was gripped by mass hysteria over witchcraft. Crop failures had devastated the area, and the population eagerly sought scapegoats. Binsfeld became a leading figure in the prosecution of witchcraft, and under his influence, over 300 people were accused, tried, and in most cases, executed. The accused were encouraged to denounce others, creating cascading waves of accusations. Some 6,000 people were ultimately implicated in the trials. Even prominent citizens were not safe. The chief judge, Dietrich Flade, found himself accused and was burned at the stake. 2 burgomasters, numerous town councilors, and several clerics met the same fate. The children of the condemned were stripped of all their belongings and sent into exile. It was a social catastrophe orchestrated in the name of fighting Satan's earthly servants. In 1589, at the height of these persecutions, Binsfeld published his influential treatise De Confessionibus Maleficorum et Sagarum, which translates as Treatise on the Confessions of Warlocks and Witches. The work codified his views on witchcraft prosecution and included a controversial claim. Even confessions extracted under torture should be believed, because the very fact that torture produced a confession demonstrated demonic influence. But buried within this work was something that would outlive the witch trials themselves. Binsfeld proposed a systematic pairing of 7 demons with the 7 deadly sins, creating what became known as Binsfeld's classification of demons. His list assigned Lucifer to pride, Mammon to greed, Asmodeus to lust, Leviathan to envy, Beelzebub to gluttony, Satan to wrath, and crucially for our purposes, Belphegor to Sloth. This was not the first such classification. An earlier 15th century English text called The Lantern of Light, often attributed to the reformer John Wycliffe, had created a similar system, but with different pairings. In that earlier version, Abaddon was paired with sloth, while Belphegor was associated with gluttony. But Binsfeld's work, translated into multiple European languages and widely distributed, became the dominant framework. The choice to reassign Belphegor from gluttony to sloth was theologically significant. Sloth in Christian theology is not simple laziness, but acedia, a spiritual condition of profound listlessness and despair. Thomas Aquinas, writing centuries earlier, identified acedia as a sadness about spiritual good, a weariness with divine things that made religious duty seem burdensome and meaningless. It was considered one of the most spiritually dangerous conditions because it directly attacked the will to seek God. Belphegor then became the demon who specifically targeted the spiritual will. He made prayer seem pointless, service feel like drudgery, and the pursuit of holiness appear impossibly exhausting. But here's where the paradox emerges. The same demonological texts that identified Belphegor as the prince of sloth also described him as a demon who helps people make discoveries, who seduces mortals by suggesting ingenious inventions that will make them rich and powerful. How could the demon of spiritual lethargy also be a patron of innovation and discovery? The answer reveals sophisticated psychological insight into how temptation actually works. Jacques Collin de Plancy's Dictionnaire Infernal, first published in 1818 and revised in 1863, provides one of the most complete descriptions of Belphegor's modus operandi. De Plancy describes him as the demon of discoveries and ingenious inventions, who seduces people by appearing in the form of a young woman and granting them ideas for inventions that will bring effortless wealth. The key word is effortless. Belphegor does not inspire genuine creativity that requires discipline, practice, and patient refinement. Instead, he offers shortcuts, the illusion that brilliance can arrive without labor. He whispers that you need not serve an apprenticeship, need not study fundamentals, need not put in 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. Instead, one brilliant idea will solve everything, and fortune will simply arrive. This is sloth disguised as ambition. The person who waits for the perfect idea, the revolutionary innovation that will make all subsequent effort unnecessary, is avoiding the daily discipline that actually builds skill and character. They are procrastinating under the guise of waiting for inspiration. They dream of being recognized as a genius without doing the work of becoming competent. Medieval theologians understood this perfectly. The vice of acedia often manifested not as complete inactivity, but as restless distraction. The slothful person might be constantly busy with trivial matters while avoiding meaningful labor. They would fill their days with busy work, with schemes and plans, with anything except the actual sustained effort required for genuine accomplishment. Belphegor's inventions, according to demonological tradition, invariably failed or brought ruin to those who pursued them. The demon would inspire someone with a seemingly brilliant discovery, convincing them to invest everything in its development, only to have it collapse at the crucial moment. The victim would be left impoverished and desperate, having neglected genuine work for a chimera. This connects to Belphegor's role in distributing wealth as a means of corruption. He does not make people work for riches. He simply gives it to them, or makes them believe riches are imminent, removing the necessity for productive labor. The idle rich, sustained by inherited wealth or sudden fortune, fall into the exact spiritual trap that Belphegor sets. Without meaningful work to structure their days and give purpose to their existence, they drift into dissipation, boredom, and despair. Contemporary accounts suggest that Belphegor's power was strongest in April, though the significance of this particular month is unclear. Some speculate it relates to the timing of spring festivals or agricultural cycles, periods when the temptation to abandon labor in favor of pleasure would be strongest. Others see it as arbitrary, one of those details that accumulate in folklore without clear origin. What is certain is that Belphegor's dual nature as both sluggard and inventor represents a sophisticated understanding of how laziness actually operates in human psychology. True sloth is rarely complete inactivity. It is misdirected energy, wasted potential, the substitution of empty motion for meaningful progress. Perhaps no aspect of Belphegor's imagery is more bizarre or memorable than the toilet throne. 19th century illustrations from Colin de Plancy's Dictionnaire Infernal depict the demon seated upon a portable commode, a pierced chair that serves as his infernal throne. This strange detail has deep roots in the demon's biblical origins. Rabbinical sources, particularly the Babylonian Talmud's Tractate Sanhedrin, describe the worship of Baal-Peor in explicitly scatological terms. According to these accounts, worshippers honored the deity by uncovering themselves and defecating before the idol, offering excrement as a sacrifice. Some rabbis claimed this was done through a hole or opening, hence connecting to the meaning of pure as gap or aperture. Whether these descriptions represented actual historical practice or were rabbinic embellishments designed to emphasize the deity's depravity is debated among scholars. Ancient fertility cults certainly involved sexual rituals that Judaism considered abhorrent, but the specific scatological elements might be exaggerations. Nevertheless, the association persisted through centuries of transmission. For Christian demonologists, this connection between Belphegor and excrement carried profound symbolic weight. Excretion represents ultimate waste, the body's disposal of what cannot nourish it, what must be expelled as worthless. To worship through such means was to celebrate waste itself, to honor unproductiveness, to make a sacrament of that which should be hidden and forgotten. The toilet throne symbolizes sloth's essential nature, wasted potential, squandered time, effort expended without achievement. Just as the body eliminates what it cannot use, the slothful person allows their life to drain away without producing anything of value. They sit, passive and unproductive, while time flows past them like sewage. Some demonological texts identified Belphegor with Crepitus, the Roman god of flatulence and bodily gas, or with Priapus, the phallic deity of gardens and fertility. These associations connected the demon to base bodily functions, to appetites and emissions that bypass human dignity and reduce people to mere animals. The phallic connections trace directly to Baal-Peor's origins as a fertility deity, possibly worshipped in the form of an erect phallus. Medieval and Renaissance demonologists often depicted Belphegor with exaggerated sexual characteristics, including an enormous phallus and gaping mouth. The mouth detail comes from the observation that Baal-Peor worship might have occurred in caves where offerings were thrown through openings. The demon's constantly open mouth symbolized insatiable appetite, eternal hunger that can never be satisfied. Wierus, a 16th century physician and demonologist, wrote that Belphegor always appeared with an open mouth, connecting this to phegor, meaning crevice or split. The image is of a being defined by openings, gaps, and voids, forever receptive but never fulfilled, consuming but never satisfied. This degraded imagery served a clear purpose in Christian demonology. Demons were to be feared, but also despised, recognized as powerful, but fundamentally pathetic. By associating Belphegor with excrement, flatulence, and base bodily functions, theologians stripped away any dignity or grandeur that might make demonic service attractive. Who would want to serve a lord of toilets and waste? Yet this very degradation made the demon psychologically accurate. Sloth degrades human potential. It reduces someone capable of greatness to someone who cannot even get out of bed. It transforms potential into waste, possibility into nothing. In the early 16th century, Niccolo Machiavelli, already famous for his political treatise, The Prince, turned his satirical talents to the subject of demons and marriage. Written sometime between 1518 and 1527 and published posthumously in 1549. Belfagor, Arcidiavolo, or The Devil Takes a Wife, became one of the most popular and frequently adapted tales in early modern European literature. The story begins in hell, where Pluto, the ruler of the underworld, faces an unusual problem. Countless male souls arriving in hell blame their damnation on their wives, claiming that marriage itself drove them to sin and misery. The demons of hell find this claim dubious. They know human nature intimately and doubt that matrimonial happiness exists at all. But to settle the question definitively, they decide to send one of their number to Earth to investigate. The demon chosen for this mission is Belphegor, described as a former archangel, now serving as an archdevil. He is given 10 years to live as a mortal man, take a wife, and determine whether marital happiness is possible. To facilitate this experiment, hell provides him with 100,000 ducats, an enormous sum that should ensure comfort and opportunity. Belphegor assumes the identity of Roderigo of Castile and travels to Florence, where he quickly establishes himself as a wealthy gentleman. He courts and marries a woman named Onesta Donati, whose name ironically means honesty. What follows is Machiavelli's savage satire of matrimonial strife and female vanity. Onesta proves spectacularly expensive. Her demands for jewelry, clothing, furnishings, and entertainment rapidly deplete Roderigo's fortune. Worse still are her relatives, who constantly appear seeking favors, loans, and positions. Roderigo, attempting to maintain his cover as a respectable, wealthy merchant, cannot refuse these importunities. Within a few short years, the 100,000 ducats are gone, and Roderigo is deeply in debt. His creditors close in, and magistrates begin pursuing him for payment. Roderigo flees Florence to escape imprisonment, pursued across the countryside by debt collectors and legal authorities. Desperate and destitute, he encounters a peasant named Gian Matteo, who takes pity on the fugitive and hides him from his pursuers. Grateful for this rescue, Belphegor offers Gian Matteo a strange gift. He will possess young women from wealthy families, allowing Gian Matteo to gain fame and fortune as an exorcist by publicly casting the demon out. The peasant agrees, and the scheme works beautifully. Gian Matteo becomes renowned throughout Italy for his ability to expel demons from possessed noblewomen, and wealthy families pay him handsomely for these services. But eventually, Belphegor decides he has fulfilled his obligation and refuses to possess any more victims. When Gian Matteo protests, the demon threatens to destroy him. The peasant must use cunning to save himself. He arranges one final exorcism before the king himself, promising to cast out a demon from the princess. But when Belphegor possesses the girl, Gian Matteo plays his trump card. He has Onesta Donati brought into the chamber. At the sight of his former wife, Belphegor immediately flees the princess's body and returns to hell, preferring the torments of the damned to reunion with Onesta. The story ends with Belphegor reporting back to Pluto that married happiness is indeed impossible, and that wives are more terrible than hell itself. Machiavelli's tale operates on multiple levels. On the surface, it is crude misogynistic humor typical of its era, part of the querelle des femmes, or battle of the sexes, literature that proliferated in Renaissance Europe. Collections with titles like Mirror of Evil Women included the story as evidence of female wickedness. But a deeper reading reveals Machiavelli's characteristic political insights hidden within the comedy. The story explores themes of deception, the importance of wit over strength, and the way clever manipulation can overcome superior power. Gian Matteo's trick at the end exemplifies one of the prince's key principles, that intelligence and adaptability matter more than raw force. The story also satirizes the institution of marriage as a kind of devilish contract, where both parties are locked into obligations neither can escape. Roderigo's inability to refuse his wife's demands or her relatives' impositions mirrors the political leader's constraint by public opinion and familial obligations. The demon, for all his supernatural power, is rendered helpless by social conventions and the expectations of marriage. Belfagor Arcidiavolo was enormously influential. It was adapted into plays, operas, poems, and prose retellings across Europe. Giovanni Francesco Straparola included his own version in Le Piacevoli Noti in 1557. English writers created multiple adaptations, including The Devil, a Married Man, published in 1647, and John Wilson's play Belphegor, or The Marriage of the Devil, in 1691. In 1923, the Italian composer Ottorino Respighi adapted it into an opera. What is striking is that Machiavelli's secular, comedic treatment of Belphegor exists alongside the deadly serious demonological texts. The same entity who tempts humanity to spiritual sloth becomes a figure of farce, defeated by a peasant's cleverness and terrified of domestic life. This multiplicity of interpretations demonstrates how folklore, theology, and literature interweave, creating layered meanings that serve different purposes in different contexts. According to Colin de Plancy's Dictionnaire Infernal, Belphegor held a specific geopolitical assignment within Hell's bureaucracy. He served as Hell's ambassador to France. This curious detail reflects both French anxieties about their own susceptibility to sin and perhaps a bit of demonological humor. France, after all, was considered the eldest daughter of the church, having been Christianized earlier and more thoroughly than many European regions. For hell to specifically target France with a dedicated ambassador suggested both the nation's importance and its vulnerability. An ambassador's role is to advance their sovereign's interests through diplomacy, persuasion, and a subtle influence rather than open warfare. Belphegor's methods fit this model perfectly. Rather than manifesting in fire and thunder, demanding worship and terrifying the population, Belphegor worked through whispered suggestions, through making sin seem sophisticated and refined. He would not appear to peasants in rural villages, but would insinuate himself into the courts of the wealthy, the salons of the intellectual elite, the universities where young minds were being shaped. His opposition, according to the Dictionnaire Infernal, was Mary Magdalene, one of France's patron saints. The choice of this particular saint as Belphegor's enemy is theologically interesting. Mary Magdalene represents repentance and the transformation from sinful past to sanctified future. She embodies the possibility that no one is beyond redemption, that change is always possible. Belphegor, as the demon of sloth, stands for precisely the opposite conviction, that change is impossible, or at least not worth the effort. He whispers that you are who you are, that attempting to improve is foolish pride, that accepting your limitations is wisdom. He makes resignation seem like maturity and surrender seem like self-knowledge. The conflict between Belphegor and Mary Magdalene is therefore the conflict between despair and hope, between the conviction that we are trapped by our nature and the possibility of grace-enabled transformation. This was particularly relevant in Catholic France, where the sacrament of confession and the possibility of absolution were central to religious life. In modern times, Belphegor's name has been attached to a mathematical curiosity that has taken on occult significance in popular culture. Belphegor's prime is a palindromic prime number that consists of the number 666, the biblical number of the beast, surrounded on each side by 13 zeros and bookended by ones, one followed by 66, sextillion, 600 quadrillion, 600 trillion, 600 billion, and 600 million one. A prime number can only be divided by itself and 1. A palindromic number reads the same forwards and backwards. Belphegor's prime is both, and its structure seems almost deliberately designed to invoke demonic associations. The 13 zeros on each side reference the superstitious fear of the number 13. The central position of 666 places the mark of the beast at the heart of the number, and the two ones framing the entire structure could be interpreted as symbolic pillars or boundaries. The prime is sometimes represented by an inverted P symbol, which has led to additional speculation about hidden meanings. Some claim this symbol appears in the Voynich manuscript, that famously undeciphered medieval codex that has baffled cryptographers for centuries. Whether this connection is real or apophenia, seeing patterns where none exist, remains debated. What is certain is that Belphegor's prime demonstrates how the demon's name has migrated from theological discourse into secular culture, mathematics, and popular mysticism. The number itself is mathematically unremarkable beyond its palindromic prime status and symbolic structure, but the name attached to it suggests that Belphegor's association with discovery and ingenuity persists even in modern contexts, far removed from Christian demonology. Belphegor stands as perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated demon in the Christian hierarchy. His contradictions are not errors in the tradition, but insights into how sin actually operates. He represents both laziness and misdirected industry, both spiritual despair and false hope in effortless success. He is patron of inventors who never actually build anything, and sovereign of slothful dreamers who are always too busy to accomplish meaningful work. His degraded imagery, the toilet throne and scatological associations, strip away any romantic notion of sin as glamorous rebellion. Sloth is not noble refusal, but pathetic waste. It does not make you a tragic figure, but a ridiculous one, sitting on a toilet while the world passes you by. Yet he is also the demon who offers shortcuts to brilliance, who makes mediocrity seem like wisdom, who convinces people that avoiding effort is a form of cleverness. His victims are not obviously wicked, but merely ineffective, not dramatically evil, but simply uselessly passive. From Baal-Peor to Binsfeld, from Machiavelli to modern mathematics, Belphegor's journey through Western culture reveals how ideas evolve across millennia. A Moabite deity of fertility becomes a demon of waste. An enemy of Israel becomes an ambassador to France. A figure of terror becomes a figure of comedy, then terror again. And through it all, he whispers the same temptation that he whispered in Eden's garden and on Peor's mountain. Why struggle? Why try? Why not simply rest? If you found this exploration fascinating and want to dive deeper into the hierarchy of hell and the other princes who rule the damned, make sure to like this video and subscribe to History Scrolls. There are 6 more deadly sins to explore, 6 more princes to unmask, and countless more stories hiding in the shadows of demonology and myth. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and never trust a demon offering easy answers.